We now render this list of books. Now the goal is to make those books clickable so that we're taken to their detail page, where we then also output the author and the best-selling status, let's say. So to do that, we of course want to work on that detail page and then wire that up. So first of all, in book detail, of course, we extend the book outlet base HTML template. And we then set the title, so with block title, like this, and set this title here then, for example, to the title of the book. That's something we could do on that detail page. So therefore here we can use interpolation and either expect a book variable where we can access title, or we expect that we just get the title like this. And I'll do the latter, but both works. It just depends on which context you then set in your view. Now, of course, we also want to set our content block here, like this. And in there, I want to have a h1 tag, let's say, where I output that title as well. So where I just repeat this interpolation. And below that, maybe an h2 tag where I have the author. So I expect to have an author variable available. Therefore, this also needs to be set by the context when we render the template. And then below that, we maybe have a paragraph where we say the book has a rating of, and then we output the rating, which we expect as a variable. And then I want to say, and is a bestseller, or but isn't a bestseller. So here I want to output content conditionally. I want to have the if tag here and check if is bestseller, if that's true. Else, I want to output something else. And then, of course, we want to end if, like this. So if it is a bestseller, I want to say the book has a rating of rating and is a bestseller. Otherwise, in the else block, and say, but isn't a bestseller, like this. And remove that blank line here. And let's see what this gives us. So that's now my template. Of course, we need a view. So here we can add the book detail view where we get the request and where we then also get some identifier for the book. For example, the ID of the book, because we'll need that to then load that book. And then here we, of course, all return render and forward that request. And of course, also specify the template that should be rendered with book outlet, book detail HTML. And then we want to set a context where we now have to provide all those variables we're accessing here in the template as keys in the context. So we need to set a title key. We need to set a author key. We also need to set a rating key here. And I also want to set the is bestseller key. But of course, the values are still missing here because those values now need to be fetched from the database. Now, assuming that we do get an ID here, we can, of course, simply get our book by reaching out to book, objects, get, and then simply get the book where the ID is equal to the ID we're getting here. And actually, you can even use PK here for primary key. That's a special named argument which you can always use to query the field which is set up as a primary key. And it turns out that in our case, it's that ID field which is configured as such. We see that in our initial migration, that ID is set as the primary key. And for the field where this is the case, which by default is always that ID field, then you can also use PK instead of ID. That's up to you. So I'll go for PK here, and then query the single book where the primary key is equal to the ID we're getting as a parameter. That's then my book. And then here, the value for title is book.title. The value for author is book.author. For rating, it's book.rating. And for is bestseller, it's book.isbestseller. So I'm pulling out that data from that data model, from that data entry we're fetching from the database, and I'm assigning those values to those keys in that context dictionary. So that's all set up. One thing is missing, of course, and that's the URLs. In my URLs.py file in the app folder, I want to add a second path, and that path should include the concrete IDs of the book which has to be loaded, because we're expecting the ID as a parameter. So therefore, we need such a dynamic path segment. We need those angle brackets, and there I want to get the ID. And this has to be named ID here, because I named the parameter here ID. You can use a different name, but then you have to change it here, obviously, and also here. And therefore, I'll stick to ID now. We can also make it clear that this should be a number, an integer to be precise, because that indeed is what our ID is. It should be transformed to an integer because it is an integer. This auto field here, this automatically incrementing ID, by default is an integer. So therefore, we should also transform the ID which we get in the URL to an integer. And then we want to load views.bookDetail, like this. With all of that, if we save everything, if we enter localhost 8000/2, I get an error that book has no attribute is bestseller, because it is best selling in my model, so that's my bad. I am using is bestseller in the template, and that is okay, because that's just a key in the context we're setting up when this template gets rendered. So we can keep this key, but I have to access book.isBestselling here, not isBestseller, because the key in the model is named isBestselling. So that's a fix I have to make. With that, if I now reload, /2, I see the Lord of the Rings data. /3, I see Harry Potter 1. /4, I see my story. And /5, I see some random book. And /6, I get an error because this does not exist. So of course we might want to handle that, and we might want to try getting this book therefore and catch any errors we might be getting, and in this case raise this HTTP 404 error, so that from Django HTTP I import HTTP 404, and I then raise this HTTP 404 error here, so that a default 404 error page would be rendered if we had one. I didn't add one here, but if we had a default 404 HTML template, then that would be rendered whenever this 404 error is raised. So that's how you could handle this. Reload, and then you would get that default 404 page here. And actually, this is such a common pattern that we can use it, but there also is an alternative. We can also set book equal to get object or 404, and then pass in our object class, our model class, like book. And then, second argument, our query criteria, like pk equals ID in this case. So what we passed to get before. And that will then do the same thing as this block of code. We just need to make sure that this get object or 404 function is imported from Django shortcuts. So you need to add that import at the top. But with it imported, you can call this helper function to get data and store it in a variable, or raise the 404 error if it doesn't exist. So we can also save that, and if I now try to load the book for /6, I also get that 404 page. So that's an alternative to manually trying and handling this. But with that, we now also load this detail page. Let's now work on wiring that up and on creating that link here.